The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, dismissed the entire Supreme Court of the country as part of a strategy to fight corruption in the judiciary and consolidate his public security policy. This measure, along with the creation of Socote, which is the largest prison in Latin America, marked a radical change in the fight against crime, where Bukele himself emphasized that, in Brazil, the problem of crime remains unsolved only because corruption is deeply rooted within the very system that runs the country.
I believe that what El Salvador shows, what it demonstrates to the world, is that all problems have a solution when there is political will. And I believe that what El Salvador is doing will probably have many differences from what Brazil needs to do. But yes, what bothers many governments is that El Salvador shows that everything can be done with the will to do it. A country fails to solve problems like crime when there is no will to address them, and sometimes because leaders are partners with criminals.
The episode of the removal of the Salvadoran Supreme Court was seen not only as an act of institutional breakdown, but also as a direct response to accusations that the Salvadoran judiciary was completely compromised by corrupt practices. Bukele argued that the justices had made decisions contrary to the emergency measures to save the country from the gang violence. By replacing the judges, he sought to consolidate a judiciary aligned with security and anti-corruption policies, even under criticism from international organizations, showing that it is possible to have a safe country as long as there is desire and willingness to act. But would this measure solve the problem of corruption in Brazil? Welcome to Vida no Quartel. Vida no Quartel. The impact of Bukele's policy was immediate. The homicide rate, which used to be one of the highest in the world, dropped drastically. The state of exception, which allowed mass arrests without court warrants, led to the detention of more than 90,000 people involved in crime. Although criticized for human rights violations, the model gained popular support with approval ratings above 80%. For many Salvadorans, the feeling of security returned after decades of gang dominance. On the anti-corruption front, Bukele announced a new front in the fight with the creation of laws that require asset transparency from public officials and their families, and toughening penalties for crimes committed through straw men.
Dictatorship of the gangs, or the dictatorship of criminals, or the dictatorship of drug traffickers. Why is this a dictatorship?
In addition, the government centralized municipalities to reduce expenses and make oversight easier. This crackdown on fraud and embezzlement of public funds reinforced the narrative that the president is seeking to eradicate corrupt practices both in the public and private sectors. El Salvador has been standing out alongside the Shield of the Americas, not only offering the Socote as a facility to imprison criminals from other countries, but also sharing the expertise acquired in confronting the maras, which are Salvadoran gangs. El Salvador's active participation in the Continental Military Coalition has received applause and support from Donald Trump, who recognized Bukele's actions as necessary to promote peace on the continent. The union of the armed forces and all police forces of El Salvador shows that the country is not limited to solving its own internal problems, but also seeks to contribute to regional security, offering cooperation in intelligence, logistics, and combat strategies. This stance reinforces the image of Nayib Bukele as a leader who has made public security an absolute priority, making El Salvador an international benchmark. In addition to making Secot available, El Salvador has been actively participating in meetings and joint operations within the Shield of the Americas, strengthening alliances with countries like Costa Rica and the United States. The sharing of information about trafficking routes, money laundering, and gang infiltration methods is seen as essential to reducing the expansion capacity of criminal organizations. This regional integration shows that fighting crime cannot be done in isolation, and that the Salvadoran experience can serve as a model for nations like Brazil, which face powerful factions such as the PCC and the Comando Vermelho.
Criminals respond with gunfire and burning barricades. From their homes, residents watch all the movement with apprehension.
The creation of the Terrorism Confinement Center symbolized El Salvador's new stance, as it is a maximum security prison designed to hold 40,000 gang members in conditions of extreme isolation. This facility was presented as a milestone in the war against crime, allowing the government to remove the leaders and members of the Maras from the streets, who controlled a large part of Salvadoran territory. The Salvadoran model, despite being controversial, has inspired leaders from other Latin American countries. Presidents like Javier Milei in Argentina and Daniel Noboa in Ecuador have already shown interest in replicating similar methods. The idea that fighting crime requires exceptional measures and a firm stance against corrupt judges and prosecutors has gained traction among hardline politicians. In Brazil, the implementation of a similar model would face significant challenges. The country has continental dimensions, autonomous state police forces, and criminal factions like PCC and Comando Vermelho, which operate with structures much more sophisticated than the Salvadoran Maras. Even so, Bukele's experience shows that the combination of direct repression and institutional reforms can produce concrete results. A possible adaptation for Brazil would be the creation of maximum security prisons, with centralized management, capable of isolating faction leaders and cutting off their communication with the outside world.
Sometimes a worker comes in here, someone who has nothing to do with it. Then they leave as a robber, they leave. We just go ahead, tough luck. We have nothing left to lose anyway.
We have more than 700,000 people in prison.
We are the third largest incarcerator in the world.
The idea is that we should always imprison more people, and there's no concern about where these prisoners will be placed.
In addition, asset disclosure measures and harsher penalties against corrupt public officials could reduce the infiltration of organized crime into public institutions. Strengthening agencies like COAF and the Brazilian Federal Revenue Service would be essential to track illicit financial flows. The problem is that in Brazil, many times, those who should be investigating and arresting end up working in crime's favor. This reversal of roles undermines the credibility of the institutions and further strengthens criminal organizations, which end up having protection within the system itself.
Few people know this. Bukele was not right-wing, he was left-wing, and he didn't promise to end the gangs, he promised to negotiate peace. But he realized that it was non-negotiable and he started changing his position, kept changing his position, and today he has a 90% approval rating in El Salvador, right? And who are we, Brazilians, to criticize the people of El Salvador who, in their sovereignty, in their wisdom, wanting to escape from that horrific period of gang violence, right, chose Bukele. Whenever a leftist colleague says, Pimentel, Bukele is a dictator, I think, sure. Living in Ipanema or Leblon, you must know more about El Salvador than its own people.
What's up? Stay em Guantão. When police officers, judges, and politicians allow themselves to be corrupted, the fight against crime loses strength and turns into a vicious cycle that's hard to break. This reality highlights the urgent need for tougher and more effective laws against public officials who engage in illegal practices. It's not enough to just punish ordinary criminals. It's essential to also hold accountable those who, through their positions of power, sustain and feed the system. Combating crime needs to start at the top, targeting the corrupt leadership and keeping them behind bars. Because, as we saw in Operation Car Wash, for example, which was one of the biggest corruption cases in the world, it wasn't able to keep any convicted individuals in prison. And today, all of them are free. Another important point is the need to tackle corruption in the Brazilian judiciary. Cases of judges and appellate judges involved in schemes to protect criminals show that the problem is not limited to the streets. The dismissal of the Supreme Court justices in El Salvador was an extreme act, but it brought to light the discussion about how to ensure that the judiciary does not become complicit in crime. In Brazil, structural reforms could be discussed to increase the accountability of judges and protect those who act honestly. The experience of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador shows that bold and controversial measures, such as the dismissal of the Supreme Court justices and the creation of Secote, can transform the reality of a country that was once dominated by gangs. For Brazil, this example serves as a reflection on the need to confront not only criminals on the streets, but also the institutional, political, and financial structures that allow the strengthening and perpetuation of crime. Leave your opinion in the comments, discussing whether a state of exception in areas dominated by drug trafficking would be effective in mitigating the tentacles of crime and why it is so difficult for this to happen in Brazil. Here at Vida No Quartel, you stay up to date with everything happening in the military world. Leave a like, subscribe, and watch one of the videos appearing on your screen. Forward fighters, see you next time.